Have you ever felt drained after spending time with someone, as if they were silently pulling energy out of you without your consent? What if I told you that every empathetic act you make, every smile, every reassurance, every attempt to keep the peace, could be secretly feeding a narcissist's hunger? And here's the unsettling truth. Carl Jung warned about this exact dynamic decades ago. Yet most people still remain blind to it. Wait until you hear this. The empath-narcissist relationship is far more insidious than most realize. It's not always dramatic. There are no shouting matches or visible confrontations at first. It's subtle, quiet, and emotionally invisible, which is precisely why it works so effectively. The narcissist thrives on what Jung might call the projection and absorption of energy, using your sensitivity against you without ever overtly showing their hand. Let's break it down. Imagine your emotional energy as a kind of currency. Every compliment you give, every conflict you de-escalate, every moment you comfort or accommodate someone else costs you a little bit of that currency. The narcissist, either consciously or unconsciously, recognizes this and begins to draw from it. They don't ask, they simply take, because the empath often doesn't recognize that giving endlessly has consequences. Over time, this subtle extraction leaves the empath exhausted, anxious, and disoriented. But here's the part nobody talks about. The empath isn't just drained emotionally. Their intuitive and psychic awareness is also being sapped. Think about it like this. Your energy isn't merely emotional, it's also cognitive and spiritual. When a narcissist exploits your empathy, they are feeding off your attention, your intuition, and your inner alignment. This is why empaths often feel foggy, indecisive, or disconnected after prolonged exposure to manipulative individuals. Consider a story. Lavra, a gifted empath, had been in a long-term friendship with someone who initially seemed charming, attentive, and supportive. Over the years, she noticed subtle patterns. He would monopolize conversations, dismiss her feelings, or create minor crises that she felt compelled to solve. It wasn't malicious in a traditional sense. It was predatory in a quiet, energetic way. Laura's energy was slowly being consumed. By the time she realized it, she felt hollow, anxious, and trapped in a cycle she couldn't articulate. Wait until you hear this. Carl Jung would describe this as a complex interplay between the persona, the shadow, and the projection of unconscious needs. The narcissist projects their unresolved fears, desires, and insecurities onto the empath, who absorbs them in a silent act of emotional diplomacy. The empath, in turn, suppresses their own boundaries, allowing themselves to become a repository for the narcissist's emotional and psychic clutter. This is why empaths feel drained without understanding why. They are literally feeding the shadows of another person. But here's the next truth. It's not always intentional on the narcissist's part. Many narcissists operate unconsciously, driven by unmet needs and unprocessed trauma. They seek validation, energy, and control simply because they have never learned how to regulate or source it internally. The danger lies in the empath's natural predisposition to accommodate, soothe, and overgive. The more the empath feeds, the more the narcissist grows dependent on that energy, creating a cycle that's almost impossible to break without awareness. Let's use a metaphor to clarify this dynamic. Imagine a candle burning in a dark room. The empath lights the candle to illuminate the space for both themselves and the narcissist. Initially, it provides warmth, guidance, and light. But if the narcissist continues to rely solely on that flame without contributing, over time the candle melts down, its energy consumed entirely. Eventually, the empath is left in darkness, exhausted, and wondering why their light, once abundant, has diminished so completely. Consider another example. Michael, a highly intuitive empath, worked with a narcissistic colleague who constantly demanded emotional support, attention, and reassurance. Michael initially felt good helping, believing it was simply kindness. However, over time he noticed chronic fatigue, disrupted sleep, and increased anxiety. The more he gave, the more the colleague seemed to need. Michael's energy was being siphoned, not just socially, but emotionally and psychically. The narcissist's hunger was invisible, yet it was real, and it was unsustainable for Michael. This next truth will shock you. Empaths often fail to recognize this energy feeding because it is subtle and normalized. Society encouraged sensitivity, compassion, and selflessness. So empaths are praised for being nice or caring too much, yet this very conditioning makes them ideal targets for narcissistic energy vampires. Giving becomes not just expected, but internalized as a moral imperative. And the narcissist, skilled in charm and subtle manipulation, exploits this unconscious conditioning effortlessly. Wait until you hear this. The most insidious part is that narcissists are often invisible in their impact until the empath is completely depleted. There are rarely dramatic confrontations at first. Instead, there is quiet erosion, subtle dismissals, tiny emotional crises, micro-manipulations, all designed to keep the empath engaged and absorbing energy. By the time the empath notices the toll, the narcissist's dependency has become entrenched, and the empath may feel trapped, confused, and guilty for needing to reclaim themselves. But here's the part nobody emphasizes enough: awareness is power. The moment the empath recognizes that their energy is being consumed, they can begin to reclaim it strategically. This involves conscious boundaries, energy management, and shadow work, all key Jungian principles. It's not about confrontation or revenge. It's about restoring psychic integrity and stopping the invisible feed that fuels the narcissist. Consider a metaphor. Picture a dam controlling a flowing river. For years, the empath has allowed the river to flow freely into the narcissist's reservoir, thinking it harmless or inevitable. Once awareness arises, the empath begins to redirect the flow, setting boundaries and reclaiming energy. The narcissist, accustomed to automatic supply, experiences confusion, frustration, and eventually, an inability to control the flood they once relied upon. Finally, understand this: the empath feeding the narcissist is not a moral failing. It's a dynamic of human psychology, shadow projection, and unconscious energy exchange. Jung warned us that these patterns exist and that they must be navigated consciously. Empaths have immense power, but without awareness, their gift becomes a liability, feeding the hunger of others at the expense of their own well-being. Now that we understand how empaths unknowingly feed narcissists, the next truth will shock you. Most empaths don't realize the ways in which they are manipulated into overgiving, often believing they are simply being kind or helpful. This is where the narcissist's subtle psychological tactics come into play, a masterclass in invisible control that Carl Jung would have described as unconscious projection and shadow feeding. But here's the part nobody talks about. Narcissists rarely ask for energy directly. They operate through implication, expectation, and subtle coercion. They know an empath's instinct is to respond, to soothe, to absorb emotional pressure. Every sigh, every look of disappointment, every small complaint is a lever, pulling at the empath's energy without ever overtly demanding it. This is why empaths often feel guilty for resting, saying no, or prioritizing themselves. The psychic feed is so normalized that withdrawal feels like betrayal. Consider a story. Naomi, a highly sensitive empath, had a close friend who seemed endlessly needy. At first, it appeared harmless, listening to stories, offering support, sharing advice. Over months, Naomi began to notice a pattern. Whenever she invested emotional energy in her friend, the friend's issues deepened or multiplied. The friend seemed to require more than she could provide, yet Naomi felt obligated to continue giving. She was feeding a hunger she hadn't recognized. Not because her friend was malicious, but because her own empathy and unconscious patterns made her a perfect target for energy extraction. Wait until you hear this. The narcissist's tactics rely heavily on subtle guilt induction. They rarely say, "Give me your energy." Instead, they create scenarios that make the empath feel responsible for their happiness, safety, or emotional balance. Statements like, "I don't know what I'd do without you," or "I thought you cared about me," activate deep empathy circuits in the brain, triggering compliance. What the empath feels as compassion is actually an energetic pull, a quiet feeding mechanism that strengthens the narcissist's control. Here's a metaphor to make it tangible. Imagine a smartphone with a parasitic app running in the background. The empath's energy is like the phone's battery. Every act of giving, every emotional response, every attempt to soothe or mediate is unknowingly draining the battery. The narcissist, like the app, consumes power silently, leaving the empath fatigued, foggy, and emotionally depleted, long before the loss becomes obvious. But here's the next truth. Awareness is the empath's first line of defense. Carl Jung emphasized consciousness as the antidote to projection. Once the empath becomes aware that their energy is being exploited, they gain the ability to reclaim it. The first step is recognizing the patterns: repeated one-sided giving, emotional exhaustion, confusion about boundaries, and a persistent feeling of being drained after interactions. Awareness does not require confrontation. It simply requires observation and clarity. Consider another story. Alex, an empath working in a corporate setting, noticed that every time a narcissistic coworker faced a crisis, whether real or manufactured, he became the default problem solver, emotional buffer, and mediator. Initially, Alex saw it as being helpful, as part of being a team player. But over time, he realized he was constantly depleted, anxious, and distracted. By observing the pattern without judgment, Alex recognized that he had been feeding the narcissist's hunger, and only by consciously disengaging in small, strategic ways could he regain his energy. Wait until you hear this. The empath's own conditioning amplifies the feeding cycle. Many empaths were taught to prioritize others, to soothe, and to manage conflict at all costs. Society labels this as moral or virtuous behavior, but in relationships with narcissists, it becomes a liability. The empath's natural tendencies make them predisposed to overgiving, which the narcissist exploits instinctively. This is why the dynamic often feels invisible, inevitable, or even unavoidable. Here's another layer. The narcissist's hunger is rarely about immediate gratification. It's about sustained supply. They rely on subtle, ongoing extraction, emotional labor, attention, validation, problem-solving that can continue for months or years. For the empath, the toll is cumulative. Sleep may be affected, intuition dulled, and emotional clarity eroded. Over time, they may feel disconnected from their own needs, mistaking fatigue for personal failure rather than recognizing it as the consequence of feeding someone else's unregulated hunger. But here's the part most people overlook. Reclaiming energy requires both strategy and self-compassion. The empath cannot simply stop giving abruptly without consequences. The narcissist may react with manipulation, guilt, or projection. Instead, the empath must approach this like a conscious energy shift. Selective engagement, emotional boundaries, and internal validation replace automatic absorption. This is not selfish, it is survival. It is the process Jung described as individuation, reclaiming the self from external projections and unconscious dependencies. Consider a metaphor. Imagine a well with a siphon connected to it. The narcissist is the siphon, quietly drawing water, emotional energy, from the empath. If the well is left unguarded, the water eventually runs dry. But if the empath installs a valve, a boundary, they control the flow, choosing when, how, and if water is released. The siphon may still attempt to draw, but without access, it fails. The narcissist's hunger remains unfulfilled, not through confrontation, but through conscious self-regulation. Wait until you hear this. Emotional and psychic boundaries are invisible but incredibly powerful. They act like a force field, allowing the empath to interact without being depleted. This involves conscious practices, pausing before giving, asking internally whether energy is being drained, and recognizing when actions serve the narcissist's hunger rather than mutual exchange. Over time, these boundaries become intuitive and non-negotiable, ensuring long-term protection. Finally, understand this. The empath's feeding of the narcissist is not a moral failing or weakness. It is a natural human dynamic, sensitivity interacting with projection, energy absorption, and unconscious patterns. The danger lies in unconscious compliance, not in empathy itself. Awareness, shadow integration, and strategic energy management transform this vulnerability into a strength. The empath can reclaim power, redirect energy, and engage in relationships consciously, feeding only where it is reciprocated, aligned, and healthy. Now that we've explored how empaths unconsciously feed narcissists, here's the next truth that will shock you. The narcissist's craving for empathic energy is not just emotional, it is psychological, almost parasitic in nature. Carl Jung would describe this as an unconscious projection of the narcissist's shadow, all the fears, insecurities, and unprocessed trauma they refuse to confront themselves. And here's the insidious part. The empath absorbs it all without even realizing it. But here's the part nobody talks about. The narcissist doesn't always know what they are doing consciously. Their hunger operates beneath awareness. They may appear charming, helpful, or attentive, but beneath the surface, they are tapping into your emotional reserves, drawing energy without effort. This is why empaths often feel inexplicably exhausted after interactions, even when nothing dramatic happened. They are feeding an invisible demand, a hunger for energy that the narcissist cannot regulate themselves. Consider a story. Jordan, an empath, worked with a narcissistic manager who seemed perfectly pleasant during meetings. Yet, after each encounter, Jordan felt drained, irritable, and disoriented. Over time, patterns emerged. The manager's crises, complaints, and subtle manipulations left Jordan's energy depleted. Jordan had been feeding the manager's unconscious hunger, acting as a reservoir for emotional and psychic energy without realizing it. The extraction was silent, invisible, and relentless, classic Jungian projection in action. Wait until you hear this. Narcissists rely on empaths for a particular kind of energy, attuned, responsive, and validating. They seek constant affirmation, emotional regulation, and problem-solving assistance. This is why empaths often feel over-responsible, as if the other person's emotional state depends entirely on their input. In reality, the narcissist's reliance is a projection of their shadow. They outsource emotional regulation to the empath because they have never learned it. Internally, here's a metaphor to clarify. Imagine a wind turbine connected to a generator. The empath's emotional energy is the wind, the raw power source. The narcissist is the generator, incapable of producing energy on their own, yet fully reliant on the wind to function. As long as the empath's energy flows, the generator spins, producing output, often in the form of charm, attention, or feigned gratitude. But the source is never replenished internally. Once the wind slows, when the empath stops overgiving, the generator falters, revealing the narcissist's dependency. But here's the subtle brilliance. Recognizing this dynamic is the first step toward empowerment. Empaths who understand that their energy is being fed into another person's shadow can take conscious steps to reclaim it. They no longer unconsciously validate, mediate, or absorb emotional energy without consideration. Instead, every interaction is measured. Is this exchange reciprocal? Does it drain or nourish? This awareness disrupts the cycle and prevents unconscious feeding. Consider another story. Mia, an empath and longtime caregiver to a narcissistic sibling, noticed a pattern. Whenever she provided emotional support, her sibling seemed to require more, never less. Mia initially blamed herself, thinking she was failing or not giving enough. Over time, she realized that her energy had been feeding her sibling's unconscious shadow. By setting clear, non-negotiable boundaries, limiting availability, redirecting attention, and enforcing emotional separation, Mia reclaimed her energy. Her sibling's frustration grew, but Mia's clarity and sovereignty became uncheckable. Wait until you hear this. The narcissist often escalates subtle manipulation when an empath begins to reclaim energy. They may employ guilt, feigned victimhood, or passive-aggressive tactics to resume the feed. This is where conscious boundaries become critical. Empaths must recognize that resistance is natural. The narcissist has been reliant on unregulated energy for years. Without strategic boundary enforcement, the cycle resumes. With awareness, it halts. But here's the next truth. The feed is not purely emotional. It can also be cognitive, psychic, and even spiritual. Empaths often absorb the mental projections, anxieties, and obsessive thoughts of narcissists. This is why interacting with a narcissist can feel disorienting, foggy, or confusing, as if your own mind is clouded by someone else's unresolved patterns. Energy reclamation must therefore operate on multiple levels: emotional, mental, and spiritual. Here's a metaphor. Imagine a sponge submerged in water. The sponge absorbs everything in its environment indiscriminately. The empath is that sponge absorbing the emotional and psychic residues of the narcissist. When awareness arises, the sponge is wrung out, boundaries are established, energy reclaimed, and the empath returns to a state of clarity. The narcissist, deprived of their unconscious supply, struggles to function without external energy. Often unaware of why they feel frustrated or depleted themselves. Consider a story. Leo, an empathic consultant, realized after months of fatigue and anxiety that a narcissistic client was draining more than just his time. The client relied on Leo's intuition, emotional attunement, and problem-solving capacity. Leo began practicing conscious energy management, pausing before engagement, evaluating the energetic cost of interactions, and maintaining mental boundaries. Over time, Leo's clarity returned, and the client's dependency became increasingly obvious. The client's frustration was an unintentional admission of their own reliance on Leo's energy. Wait until you hear this. Reclaiming energy is not selfish. It is survival. Carl Jung emphasized consciousness as the antidote to projection. By observing patterns, setting boundaries, and engaging selectively, empaths disrupt the narcissist's unconscious feeding. They reclaim autonomy, restore psychic integrity, and prevent burnout. Energy that was once unconsciously surrendered is now consciously managed, ensuring emotional and psychological sovereignty. But here's the final warning for this section. Ignoring the feed can have long-term consequences. Chronic exposure to narcissistic energy extraction leads to fatigue, lowered intuition, impaired decision-making, and even physical symptoms. The empath may internalize responsibility for the narcissist's emotional state, creating cycles of anxiety, depression, and self-doubt. Early recognition and intervention are critical to prevent these outcomes and preserve mental, emotional, and spiritual health. Finally, understand this: the empath's power lies not in overgiving but in conscious energy management. Awareness transforms vulnerability into strength. Recognizing the narcissist's hunger, reclaiming energy, and enforcing boundaries ensures that the empath is no longer feeding a shadow they cannot control. The narcissist, deprived of unconscious supply, is forced to confront their own limitations, often without realizing it. Now that we understand the subtle mechanics of how empaths feed a narcissist's unconscious hunger, the next truth will shock you. Breaking the cycle isn't about confrontation, anger, or drama. It's about conscious energy management, psychological boundaries, and awareness of subtle manipulation. And here's the first step that almost no one talks about. The empath must learn to observe without absorbing, but here's the part nobody talks about. Empaths are naturally wired to absorb others' emotions, to feel what others feel. This gift, while extraordinary, becomes a liability in the presence of a narcissist. Every sigh, every disappointment, every subtle criticism is a potential drain. The empath must now shift from reactive absorption to selective engagement. This means noticing the emotional state of the other without letting it dictate your energy or decisions. Consider a story. Isabel, a deeply sensitive empath, realized that her friend's constant neediness was draining her creativity, focus, and emotional balance. Initially, she tried to help as she always had, with full immersion and emotional investment. But the result was always exhaustion. Once, Isabel began observing her friend's emotions without absorbing them, acknowledging the situation, but refusing to internalize it. Her energy returned. Her interactions became purposeful, not draining, and the narcissist's subtle reliance on her began to falter. Wait until you hear this. Establishing emotional boundaries is not optional, it is essential. For an empath, a boundary is not about punishing the narcissist. It is about creating a space where your energy is protected. This can be as simple as mentally visualizing a barrier before interactions, limiting time spent with draining individuals, or politely redirecting energy when someone attempts to monopolize it. The narcissist, who has long relied on unconscious access to your energy, will immediately feel resistance, often leading to frustration, subtle manipulation, or emotional escalation. Here's a metaphor. Imagine a garden. Your emotional energy is the soil, fertile and rich. The narcissist is a parasitic vine, rooting into your soil and draining nutrients silently. Without awareness, the vine grows unchecked, leaving your garden barren. But once you recognize the parasitic behavior, you erect a protective trellis, a boundary. The vine can no longer access your nutrients freely. Over time, your garden flourishes. And the narcissist's attempts to siphon energy fail, but here's the subtle brilliance. Self-awareness amplifies empowerment. Carl Jung emphasized that consciousness is the key to individuated living. The empath who observes, understands, and recognizes patterns can reclaim autonomy. This involves not only identifying manipulative behaviors, but also understanding your own emotional triggers. Why do you feel compelled to give endlessly? What unconscious fears or conditioning drive your overgiving? Shadow work, self-reflection, and journaling are crucial tools for this process. Consider another story. David, an empathic team leader, was constantly pulled into a narcissistic colleague's crises. Initially, he felt guilty stepping back. But through reflection, he realized his overgiving was rooted in a fear of conflict and a desire for approval. By acknowledging this shadow, David could consciously respond instead of react. He set firm limits on availability, redirected attention to productive tasks, and practiced internal validation. His energy returned, his clarity improved, and the narcissist's subtle attempts at energy extraction weakened. Wait until you hear this. Another critical tool is intentional energy allocation. Empaths often give energy indiscriminately, driven by habit or emotional compulsion. Post-awareness, the empath must decide where energy is invested. This includes prioritizing relationships that are reciprocal, projects that are aligned with purpose, and interactions that provide nourishment rather than depletion. Think of it as financial budgeting. Energy is a limited resource, and each investment must yield a return, emotional, mental, or spiritual. But here's the part nobody emphasizes. Detachment is different from abandonment. Empaths can remain compassionate without overgiving. Detachment involves observing without absorbing, engaging without overinvesting, and responding without compulsive rescue. This is not coldness. It is conscious protection. Narcissists may attempt to guilt or manipulate at first, but a consistent, detached response disrupts the feeding cycle and reinforces the empath's sovereignty. Here's a metaphor. Picture a lighthouse in a storm. The empath illuminates their surroundings, offering guidance and clarity, but the waves, the narcissist's manipulations, cannot penetrate the structure. The lighthouse stands firm, energy intact, offering light only when it is safe and intentional. The storm may rage, but the foundation is unshakable. Consider a story. Olivia, an empath with a narcissistic family member, initially absorbed every complaint, criticism, and manipulation. She was exhausted and anxious. Through conscious boundary setting and selective engagement, Olivia began responding only when necessary, refusing to internalize energy that wasn't hers. Her mental clarity and emotional resilience improved dramatically. The family member, frustrated by the lack of unconscious energy access, began seeking alternative sources, leaving Olivia protected and empowered. Wait until you hear this. Energy reclamation is an ongoing practice. It is not a one-time event or reaction to crisis. Daily practices, meditation, journaling, visualization, intentional self-care, reinforce boundaries, and maintain clarity. The narcissist may attempt to test limits repeatedly, but consistent energy management ensures their influence remains minimal. Over time, the empath gains control over their energy, their time, and their emotional life. But here's the next truth. The empath's transformation affects not only the narcissist, but the wider environment. When energy is no longer unconsciously surrendered, relationships shift. Others recognize the clarity, calm, and intentionality the empath exhibits. Manipulative patterns that were once tolerated are now visible to all. The empath's empowerment creates ripple effects, reshaping social dynamics and diminishing the narcissist's subtle control. Finally, understand this. Stopping the feed is not about blame or confrontation. It is about reclaiming autonomy, protecting energy, and living consciously. Carl Jung's warning is clear. Empaths must recognize when they are feeding another's shadow. Awareness, boundaries, and selective engagement are the antidote. By observing, reclaiming, and directing energy intentionally, The empath not only survives, but thrives, transforming vulnerability into power and subtle manipulation into irrelevance. Now that we've established the foundation of awareness and boundary setting, here's a truth that will shock you. Reclaiming your energy from a narcissist is not just emotional, it's psychic and spiritual work. Carl Jung warned that unconscious energy exchanges can subtly shape personality, intuition, and even spiritual clarity. The empath who ignores this process risks long-term depletion that can distort perception, decision-making, and personal growth. But here's the part nobody talks about. The narcissist's hunger doesn't just manifest in emotional exhaustion. It subtly disrupts the empath's inner alignment, clouding intuition, distorting perception, and creating a constant low-level anxiety. Empaths often blame themselves, thinking they're too sensitive, too reactive, or too inadequate, when in reality their psychic and emotional energy has been unconsciously siphoned. Recognition of this subtle drain is the first step toward true reclamation. Consider a story. Naomi, an empath working in a high-stress environment, noticed a persistent fog over her intuition. She constantly second-guessed decisions and felt drained even after restful sleep. By reflecting on her interactions with a narcissistic colleague, she realized that much of her energy was being unconsciously absorbed. The realization was liberating. Once she began implementing conscious boundaries, meditation practices, and selective engagement, the fog lifted. Her clarity, intuition, and confidence returned, and the narcissist's subtle control diminished. Wait until you hear this. One of the most powerful tools for energy reclamation is visualization. Imagine a protective shield around yourself, allowing energy to flow in a controlled way and deflecting draining influences. This is not mystical fluff. It is a psychological tool that creates a tangible sense of agency. Every time an empath visualizes energy protection before interacting with a narcissist, the subconscious mind begins to internalize boundaries, creating a new default pattern of conscious engagement rather than automatic absorption. Here's a metaphor to make it concrete. Think of the empath as a battery-powered device. A narcissist, intentionally or not, is a rogue charger drawing power silently and constantly. Visualization and psychic shielding act as a regulator, controlling the flow of energy and preventing unauthorized depletion. The empath can now give consciously, recharge intentionally, and prevent unconscious draining, reclaiming sovereignty over their own emotional and psychic resources. But here's the next truth. Emotional detachment is critical, but it's not emotional neglect. Detachment is about observing without absorbing, caring without giving endlessly, and responding without allowing the narcissist to feed off your psychic energy. It is a disciplined practice of conscious emotional engagement. The narcissist, who thrives on reactive absorption, will test this detachment repeatedly. Consistency is key. The moment the empath wavers, the cycle can resume. Consider another story. Jordan, an empath in a long-term friendship with a narcissistic partner, realized that his overgiving was rooted in guilt and a desire for approval. He began consciously limiting availability, responding with clarity rather than reaction, and using visualization to protect energy during interactions. Initially, his friend resisted, employing subtle manipulations to reclaim access. But over months, Jordan's consistent boundaries rewired the dynamic. The narcissist's hunger could no longer be unconsciously satisfied, and Jordan's energy, intuition, and emotional balance flourished. Wait until you hear this. Another critical tool is selective empathy. Empaths are naturally wired to respond to others' emotions, but not every emotional situation requires full absorption. Selective empathy involves assessing whether engagement is necessary, reciprocal, or draining. By consciously choosing where to invest energy, the empath prevents unconscious feeding while still maintaining compassion and integrity. This distinction is vital. It's not about withdrawing from humanity. It's about directing energy wisely. Here's a metaphor. Picture a river flowing into multiple channels. The empath's energy is the river. In unconscious feeding, the river is diverted into toxic channels controlled by the narcissist, leaving other areas barren. With selective empathy, the empath consciously directs flow only to fertile, reciprocal channels. Energy is replenished, purpose is aligned, and the narcissist's parasitic reliance is interrupted. But here's the subtle brilliance. The reclaiming process also involves shadow integration. Jung emphasized that unacknowledged aspects of the self-anger, frustration, assertiveness are often suppressed by empaths in an attempt to maintain harmony. The narcissist unconsciously exploits this suppression. By consciously embracing these shadow traits, the empath gains confidence, assertiveness, and resilience. This inner empowerment naturally disrupts the narcissist's ability to feed off vulnerabilities. As the empath no longer suppresses essential parts of themselves, consider a story. Sophia, an empathic mother, constantly mediated conflicts between her narcissistic family member and others. Over time, she became exhausted, resentful, and emotionally drained. Through shadow work, she embraced her anger, set firm boundaries, and reclaimed her assertive voice. The narcissist's manipulations no longer bypassed her, as she had integrated aspects of herself that previously went unnoticed. Energy feeding ceased, and Sophia's emotional and psychic resilience flourished. Wait until you hear this. Daily practices amplify energy protection. Meditation, journaling, intentional rest, grounding exercises, and conscious energy checks ensure the empath remains sovereign. Without consistent maintenance, the subtle feed can resume, as narcissists are adept at testing boundaries and exploiting lapses. Awareness and repetition reinforce the new energetic patterns, ensuring long-term protection. But here's the next truth. The narcissist's hunger will not simply disappear. Awareness and energy reclamation provoke frustration, subtle testing, and escalation. The empath must maintain vigilance, clarity, and consistency. Resistance to the unconscious feeding does not mean cruelty or rejection. It is a necessary act of self-preservation and psychological integrity. Over time, this disciplined practice rewires interactions, limiting the narcissist's influence and strengthening the empath's sovereignty. Finally, understand this: reclaiming energy is transformative, not only in relation to the narcissist, but in every area of life. Emotional clarity, mental focus, spiritual alignment, and intuition expand dramatically when the empath stops feeding a shadow that isn't theirs. Carl Jung's warning resonates here. Empaths must become conscious of energy dynamics to avoid subtle consumption, regain autonomy, and cultivate resilience. The process is not optional. It is essential for psychological, emotional, and spiritual health. Now that we've explored emotional and psychic energy reclamation, here's a truth that will shock you. The narcissist doesn't just rely on empathy for emotional support. They crave it as a silent source of power. Carl Jung would describe this as a shadow projection, where the narcissist unconsciously displaces their own unresolved fears, insecurities, and desires onto the empath. And here's the terrifying part. Unless the empath becomes conscious of this dynamic, it can continue indefinitely, quietly eroding their energy, clarity, and confidence. But here's the part nobody talks about. The narcissist's hunger is strategic, even if unconscious. They seek consistency. They crave automatic availability, unchallenged compliance, and emotional labor that comes without boundaries. Every empathic act that goes unquestioned strengthens the pattern, creating a feedback loop where the narcissist's dependence grows while the empath's vitality diminishes. This is why awareness alone is not enough. It must be paired with consistent, intentional action. Consider a story. Hannah, an empathic teacher, noticed that a narcissistic colleague seemed to monopolize her attention. Daily, subtle requests, emotional complaints, and indirect criticisms. Initially, Hannah felt guilty for needing her own space. But through awareness, she realized that each interaction drained her energy while feeding the colleague's unresolved insecurities. She began setting small but firm boundaries, limiting availability, redirecting conversations, and internalizing the knowledge that she was not responsible for his emotional stability. The effect was immediate. She felt lighter, clearer, and more aligned with her own energy. Wait until you hear this. One of the most powerful tools an empath can employ is psychic shielding. Think of it as a protective field that allows interactions without unconscious absorption. Visualization is key. Imagine an energetic barrier that deflects manipulation, subtle guilt, and emotional feeding. The empath can still engage, care, and respond, but energy is no longer automatically siphoned. Psychic shielding is not arrogance or detachment from humanity. It is conscious protection, a necessary skill in the presence of narcissistic influence. Here's a metaphor. Imagine your energy as a pool of water. The narcissist is a straw constantly drawing from it. Without awareness, water is lost invisibly, leaving you depleted. Psychic shielding acts like a valve on the straw. You control the flow, allowing energy exchange only when it serves mutual growth. Over time, this valve becomes instinctive, empowering the empath to interact without being consumed. But here's the next truth. Energy reclamation is not a one-time event. It's a practice, a discipline, and a mindset. Daily habits reinforce boundaries and prevent unconscious depletion. Meditation, grounding exercises, journaling, and energy visualization create a protective rhythm. Without consistent reinforcement, subtle manipulation can resume. As narcissists are highly adept at testing limits and exploiting even brief lapses, consider another story. Marcus, an empathic counselor, found himself chronically exhausted after sessions with a narcissistic client. He initially blamed himself, thinking he needed to try harder, give more attention, or solve the client's unresolved issues. Through energy awareness and psychic shielding, Marcus implemented pre-session visualizations, internal boundaries, and post-session energy checks. Over time, he noticed a profound shift. The client's attempts to siphon energy were deflected, leaving Marcus clear, focused, and empowered. Wait until you hear this. Another critical aspect of reclaiming energy is intentional detachment without guilt. Empaths are often conditioned to feel responsible for others' emotional states. Saying no, limiting availability, or disengaging is not selfish. It is essential self-preservation. The narcissist may respond with guilt-tripping, passive-aggressive behavior, or subtle emotional manipulation, but these are tests of the empath's boundaries. Consistent, guilt-free detachment rewires the dynamic and reduces the narcissist's unconscious dependence. Here's a metaphor. Picture a lighthouse amidst stormy seas. The empath provides illumination, guidance, and stability. But the waves, representing the narcissist's manipulations, cannot penetrate the structure. The lighthouse stands firm, energy intact, offering light only intentionally. Over time, the storm passes without consuming the lighthouse, and its foundation remains unshakable. But here's the subtle brilliance. Reclaiming energy doesn't just protect the empath. It transforms relationships and social dynamics. When energy is no longer unconsciously surrendered, the narcissist's influence diminishes. They become less controlling, manipulative, or demanding as their automatic supply is cut off. Other relationships also shift positively. Clarity, emotional presence, and personal empowerment attract reciprocity, alignment, and respect. Consider a story. Layla, an empath who constantly mediated her narcissistic partner's emotional crises, began practicing psychic shielding, daily boundary reinforcement, and selective engagement. The partner, initially frustrated by the lack of unconscious energy access, began seeking alternative sources. Layla, now empowered, found her clarity, intuition, and emotional stability dramatically improved. Her social circles responded to this energy shift, reinforcing positive dynamics and diminishing toxic influence. Wait until you hear this. Energy reclamation is also deeply tied to shadow integration. Empaths often suppress assertiveness, anger, and self-prioritization to maintain harmony. Narcissists unconsciously exploit these suppressed traits. By integrating these shadow aspects, empaths gain assertiveness, confidence, and resilience, naturally blocking the siphoning of energy. Shadow work, meditation, and reflective journaling strengthen the empath's internal authority, making unconscious feeding impossible. But here's the part nobody emphasizes enough. Energy protection is holistic. Emotional, psychic, mental, and spiritual energy all intertwine. When one area is depleted, others are affected. Therefore, comprehensive practices combining boundaries, visualization, selective engagement, and shadow integration ensure sustainable empowerment. The empath not only stops feeding the narcissist but grows stronger, more intuitive, and aligned with their true self. Finally, understand this: the narcissist's hunger will always exist. But the empath's sovereignty is unassailable when boundaries are conscious. Energy management is intentional, and shadow aspects are integrated. Carl Jung's final warning resonates here. Empaths must be vigilant, intentional, and disciplined to prevent unconscious depletion. By practicing consistent energy reclamation, the empath transforms vulnerability into strength and subtle manipulation into irrelevance.